Imagine this. In a single night, an entire region's memory is just washed away. Decades of history, of life, of art, all captured on film and tape, just vanished into a toxic sludge. It was a cultural catastrophe, and this is the story of what we lost. That quote, it's from a veteran editor at the Czech Television studio in Ostrava, and it just hits you, right? An institution without a past. It speaks to a loss so total, it's like history itself was just deleted. So how on earth could something like this happen? And what exactly was lost forever in the flood? So the victim here, it wasn't a person. It was an institution, the Ostrava Television Archive. You have to understand, this was the living, breathing memory of a really unique and vital part of Europe, the industrial heartland of what is now the Czech Republic. Now, this archive wasn't just some dusty collection of tapes in a back room. It was the region's autobiography, written on film. For over 40 years, it documented everything: the lives of coal miners and steelworkers, the political oppression of the so-called normalization era, and of course, the incredible hope of the Velvet Revolution. Losing this collection, it meant losing the real story, the on-the-ground perspective you'd never get from the official state media. So you have this priceless archive, this cultural memory bank. And then the villain of our story shows up. And this wasn't just a bad storm. Meteorologists literally called it the flood of the century. The culprit was this very specific, very rare weather event called a Veba cyclone. The easiest way to think about it is like this. Imagine a massive storm system acting like a sponge, soaking up huge amounts of moisture from the Mediterranean Sea. Then it moves over Central Europe and just parks itself. It just stalls. And the result? Well, in only 5 days, the region got hit with more than half of its average annual rainfall. Now, you might be thinking, why on earth was it all in the basement? And tragically, it made sense at the time. Film collections are incredibly heavy, and basements are built to support that weight. But when the rivers overflowed, they weren't just carrying water. This was an industrial region, so the flood brought this toxic soup of sewage, chemical runoff, and debris, a black water that turned a terrible natural disaster into a cultural apocalypse. Okay, so let's get into the anatomy of the loss. What did this black water actually take from us? The numbers, well, they're just staggering. It's an inventory of erasure. First up, 30,000. 30,000 news film reels. I mean, just try to wrap your head around that. This was the daily diary of life in the region, the raw, unfiltered footage of local festivals, of strikes, of small personal triumphs and public tragedies. All of it just gone. Then another number, 6,000. 6,000 finished films. Now, this wasn't just raw footage. These were the polished documentaries, the television plays produced by the studio, basically the entire creative, artistic output of this station for decades. Wiped out. And this next one, this is a real gut punch. 9,000 scripts. It's such a devastating detail because even if the images were gone, maybe the story could have survived in the text, but the flood took the words too. It's this tragic double erasure. When you see it all laid out like this on a table, it's really sobering. Over 50,000 individual items gone. But I want you to look at that last line. The registry, the spisovna as it was called, 100% lost. That is by far the most devastating number on this list, and we're gonna come back to why in just a minute. So you might be wondering, how does dirty water actually destroy this stuff? Well, for old film stock, the gelatin that literally holds the image to the film base, it just swells up and dissolves in contaminated water. For videotape, the chemical binders that hold the magnetic particles on the tape break down. And in both cases, the grit and silt in the sludge acts like sandpaper, just physically scraping the information away. Two totally different technologies, but they shared the same brutal fate. But the story doesn't just end with destruction. What happened next was, well, it was heroic. In the immediate aftermath, a desperate rescue mission began, led by the studio's own heartbroken staff. They actually called themselves Bajina, which means the swamp. And for months, that's literally what they were doing, wading through the foul-smelling mud of their own history. They frantically pulled out what they could, painstakingly washed individual film reels by hand, and tried to stabilize the waterlogged tapes. It was grueling, hazardous, and so often completely heartbreaking work. To really feel the weight of this, you have to look at the individual stories. There was this beloved, completely non-political nature series called Hunts Without Weapons. It was a show that connected this heavily industrial population with the natural world, and its master tapes were just destroyed. All that's left are memories and some records that it once existed. But then, sometimes you get a miracle. A documentary series from 1969 about an expedition to Australia. It was banned by the communists, and everyone thought it was destroyed in the flood. But then, 20 years after the flood, in 2017, the director's son came back from Australia with his father's personal copies. The diaspora, the people who had left, had accidentally become a life-saving backup archive. It's just an amazing thought, right? So, when all is said and done, what is the final legacy of this disaster? It's really this permanent void, this ghost that haunts the historical record of Central Europe. And that brings us back to that registry, the Specimena, and why its loss was so profound. Its complete destruction created a historical black hole. You see, archivists don't just mourn the 30,000 films they know are gone. They're haunted by the countless others they can no longer even name or identify. We don't just miss the history. We no longer even know the full shape of what we're missing. The Austrieva disaster was a physical thing. Water, silt, chemicals destroying physical objects. Today, our archives are digital, just bits and bytes on servers. They feel safe, almost intangible. But are they? What's our modern version of that toxic flood? A catastrophic server failure? A crippling ransomware attack? Or maybe just the slow, silent death of a file format the computers in the future can no longer read? The flood of 1997 is this grim, chilling reminder that no memory is guaranteed. And it forces us to ask, is our digital history really any safer from being washed away?